If you're a university student, chances are you spend a lot of your time taking notes. If you're a professional, chances are you also spend a lot of your time taking notes. So if we spent so much time taking notes, how come no one ever taught us how to do it properly? In this video, my goal is to teach you the right way to take notes so that you spend less time taking them, less time reviewing them, and do a better job of remembering the material. So let's get into it. The first thing you want to do when you're learning how to take notes is to start with the very basic question of why. Why are you taking notes in the first place? It's not because you want a verbatim transcription of the lecture or of the meeting that you're attending. If all you wanted was a transcript, then there are probably a ton of better ways to do this, either by recording the thing or by getting someone to take sort of secretarial notes or something like that. But generally speaking, when you're taking notes, your goal here is not to create a transcript, but it's so that you can remember the material that is being taught or the material that is being discussed. Ultimately, taking notes is a way to retain what you're taking notes about. So if we want to do a better job of taking these notes and we want to do a better job of retaining this stuff, first we need to kind of understand how the brain works. So the way the brain works is essentially there's a few different parts to the process of learning something. So you start with whatever information that you're trying to learn, okay? And then that information needs to go into, I'm going to call this a person, and this is their brain, their cerebellum, and little spinal cord. And essentially, we've got two parts to this, right? So we've got information, and we need to get the information into the brain. That process is what we call encoding. Once you've encoded information in your brain, it's stored somewhere in your memory. Whenever you want to use that information, you need to pull it back out of your brain so that you can use it. And that process is something called recall. So essentially what we're doing when we're taking notes is we are doing the encoding portion of learning. We're finding a way to get information from outside of our brain into our brain. That is essentially what the goal of taking notes is all about. This is what leads us to the very first mistake most people make when they're taking notes, and that is to transcribe things verbatim. I remember that when I was in school, there was always this set of students who sat at the very front of the class, and when I was in school, laptops in class were just at the very beginning stages of being something that you saw, and so you'd have these students who sat at the front of the class with their laptops, and because this was, close to 20 years ago, the laptops were these giant, enormous machines, and they'd be sitting there and they'd be typing and pecking, and you would just hear this super loud clacking sound because also laptop keyboards were really loud at the time. And essentially at the end of the lecture, what you'd have someone who had transcribed every single thing the professor said verbatim. The trouble with this approach is if we go back to what we just saw about how memory works and how learning works, by transcribing something verbatim, you're not actually doing a really good job of encoding because you're not focusing on the information, you're just focusing on the transcription. So if we shouldn't be transcribing lectures verbatim, how do we take good notes so that we remember what is being said? Well, essentially, good notes have three elements to them. The first of these elements are what we'll call keywords. So rather than transcribing something verbatim, you want to pick out those words that are the most important, those words that are usually specific to the discipline that you're learning about. In some disciplines, these are known as terms of art. Essentially, you want to pull out the most important concepts, and those are the things that you want to jot down. Now, just writing down a bunch of keywords, keyword 1, keyword 2, keyword 3, and so on and so forth, that's not going to be particularly helpful for you because just jotting a bunch of stuff down in a list order, that's not going to be useful. That's what brings us to the second most important part of taking notes, and that is understanding how concepts relate to each other. So any type of note that you're taking, you're going to want to find a way to draw concepts together. And later in this video, I'll look at 3 very popular note-taking systems and how you use those to essentially put into place these principles. But once you've taken down these keywords or these concepts, the next thing you're going to want to do is figure out how these things link to each other. So sometimes you're going to have relationships between things that are more causal, there's cause and effect. Other times you're going to have sort of these loops of things where one thing comes back to another. Sometimes these loops go both ways. Sometimes one thing is going to be subordinate to another. and so on and so forth. And so you want to find a way to visually represent the item that you are trying to learn. The third element that you're going to want to include in all of your notes is essentially questions. So questions are not just things that you are unclear about, but they're anything that is sort of a path that you want to further explore. So maybe it's not even something that's directly related to the material that you're learning right now, but maybe it's how does this stuff relate to something else that you learned in a different class or to another topic that you discussed in a different meeting. Maybe it has to do with just plain curiosity of, okay, I don't need to know this for this specific conversation, but maybe it's something that piques your curiosity and you want to kind of understand how it works a little bit better. So it gives you further avenues of exploration later on. Asking yourself questions and putting those questions directly in your notes is going to force your brain to work in such a way where it is making the mental effort of trying to figure out what other places you can go with information. So between the keywords, the connections, and the questions, essentially what you're doing as you're taking these notes is you're forcing your brain to actually work. As opposed to when you're transcribing someone's speech, all you're doing is kind of forcing your fingers to move as quickly as possible. When you're taking notes in this fashion, you're actually forcing your brain to do some of the work of understanding or picking out, first of all, what the most important pieces are, as opposed to transcribing everything. So step one, already your brain has to focus on, okay, only this is the most important stuff. Then the brain has to do some work to figure out how these different items relate to each other. And then it will also create this path where the brain will think about, okay, now that I've understood how these things work together, what other avenues are there where I could draw additional connections later on? And so it's a third way for the brain to put in some extra work. All of this work that the brain is helping you actually encode the information. And the purpose of encoding this information is it helps it stick into your brain so that later on when we get to the recall portion, you actually have something to pull out. Because if the information has never been properly encoded in the first place, and you go to recall that information to use it at a later date, you're going to just find a big hole where you expected to find the information. So encoding is super important, and taking notes should be really about figuring out the best way to encode information into your mind. Now let's move on to how you should take notes so that they are as effective as possible. And I'm going to break this down into 3 parts. The first of which being that your notes should probably be as visual as possible. You'll notice that as I'm talking through this video, I'm jotting some things down, and I've done little drawings, even though they're absolutely terrible. Those drawings and the effect of putting that visual language on paper or on screen, that actually helps your brain to put a different spin on information. Whereas if you're just taking words out of the air and putting words back on paper or on a screen, it doesn't force your brain to work as hard. So you're using a different mode of learning when you are drawing something, and the more modes of learning you engage, the better you actually retain information. So drawing things and putting things into your notes visually can be really helpful. Really clear example of this from my own experience. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, we did the whole birthing class thing, as most new parents do. And as we were going to these classes, in order to find ways to kind of keep myself engaged, because as the non-childbearing partner, your involvement in these classes tends to be a little bit less. But I was there and I was taking notes, and I was, to some extent amusing myself by sort of doodling my notes. Fast forward 5 years to our second child, and during the delivery process for our second child, my wife needed to manage the pain in a way where, there was no time to get drugs or anything like that. And so she had to find a way to manage the pain. I still remembered 5 years later where the pressure points that I needed to apply pressure to help relieve her pain from a single birthing class that I had taken 5 years earlier. And the only reason I was able to remember that is because in my mind, I could visualize the little doodles that I made of where those pressure points were. So if there's any doubt in your mind that doodling or visual learning is something that can help you retain more information, take it from me, it is a godsend in situations where information needs to be recalled. The second element in terms of how you take notes is all about timing. So when should you actually take notes? Part of the challenge with taking notes in the present moment and sort of trying to transcribe everything in the moment is that as you are worrying about getting as much information down as you possibly can, the actual content of what is being said to you is being lost because you're focused so much on getting notes down that you're not actually paying attention to what's being said. And so there's actually 2 ways you can do this. One is, instead of transcribing everything verbatim, like we've said, bad idea, just take down those main keywords and concepts so that you don't lose those, and then come back to your notes after the fact and find ways to elaborate on those keywords. Now, I'm not saying wait 2 days. I'm saying if you have a lecture, for example, and you're taking notes, jot down some keywords and then come back to the notes right after class and sort of fill in the gaps from your memory. Again, this will force your brain to do some work. It'll force you to pay attention because that is how you're going to be able to fill in those gaps. And it'll help you to encode the information that much better. The other option you have is to simply completely wait until there's a pause or a break and take all of your notes after the fact. This is kind of like the first method, but on steroids. I don't necessarily suggest this for anyone who's doing this for the first time, but as you become more confident in your note-taking, this might be something that you want to explore. And the last element I want to talk about when we talk about how you should take notes is to answer the question, should your notes be pretty? Now, there is a trend going on right now, it's been going on for a few years now, where people online are posting their absolutely gorgeous, beautifully created, beautifully crafted notebooks and journals and their study notes, and they have beautiful color schemes with beautiful art, and they are absolutely gorgeous. Now, the real question here is, does all of that actually help you learn better? And the short answer is no, it doesn't. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that someone who takes prettier notes will learn better. My terrible doodles that you've seen in this video are going to be just as effective as someone who has Leonardo da Vinci level notes and drawing capabilities at helping you to retain that information. In fact, if you're spending too much time making your notes look pretty, you're probably not spending enough time on the material itself and doing the other things around note-taking that are going to help you be better at learning the material. So my suggestion is, yes, you want to go a little bit beyond just writing words on the page. You want to make them a little bit more visual. You want to make your notes a little bit more dynamic, but you need to stop short of making them works of art, because at that point, you have kind of lost the forest for the trees. The goal here is to learn the material, not to turn your study notes into a work of art. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the principles behind note-taking and some of the tips that you can use to make sure your notes work, I want to go through 3 very popular note-taking methods that you may have heard of, and just kind of go through what those look like so that maybe you can use those particular styles in your learning. Now, there's no right or wrong way to take notes. As far as I know, no one has proven that one specific method is better than the others. So it's always a good idea to have a bunch of these methods in your back pocket so you can pick and choose those that are the best for you and the best for that particular circumstance. So the first method of taking notes is the outline method. And the outline method is exactly what it sounds like. So you essentially are going to be building an outline of the notes that you are taking. So you're going to start with your first point, and that is going to be point 1, and then you'll have, your second point, and that'll be point 2, and then at some point you will have a subpoint to point 2, so point A, subpoint, and then maybe you will have a subpoint to point A, which will be a subpoint, and so on and so forth. And you'd keep going here, 4, 4A, 4B, 5, and then at some point this is going to get really messy because you're going to realize that this point here actually relates back to this point here, and so on and so forth. Now, the point with an outline method is not that it needs to be super well structured or super organized. The thing that the outline method does well is it allows you to see the relationship between different concepts. Where it kind of falls apart is if you are following a lecture that's not particularly well structured to begin with, it is very difficult to build a proper outline because you're going to have a lot of these arrows pointing all over the place. That's not necessarily a bad thing because it's forcing you to go back and make the relations in your own head, which will help with the encoding, but it can make for some messy notes and it can be a little bit more difficult to review after the fact. So generally speaking, when you're using the outline method and you're not following a particularly structured lesson, you are going to probably have to do more work after the fact to clean that up. The second method, which is very popular for note-taking and that has gained a little bit of a cult following, is what's known as the Cornell method. So the Cornell method was obviously named after Cornell University, and it has a very specific structure to it, which kind of goes back to the principles we looked at the beginning of this video. So the Cornell method starts with the concept of a blank page, right? So you got this here, here. Yep. Okay, so you've got your blank page. And then with the blank page, you're essentially going to cut your page into 3 parts. So you're going to have a part at the bottom, and then you are going to split the top part into a left-hand margin and a right portion. And essentially, the idea behind the Cornell method is in the main body of your notes, you are going to follow your outline method as you normally would, right? So you have your bullet points, and then your sub-bullet points, and then your other bullet points, and you would kind of take your notes normally just as you would with the outline method. The difference here is with the Cornell method, you also have these other 2 sections, and in the left-hand margin, what you're going to do is you're going to call out, as you're taking these notes, you're going to call out the specific keywords that these different bullets are about, so that when you review your notes after the fact, you've got these specific keywords you can use as anchor points to say, this is all the information about this specific concept. And then the bottom part of the page is what you are going to use as your space to ask yourself questions about the material that you are covering in this sort of main body portion here. So the Cornell method is essentially just a way to organize your notes so that you're keeping in mind the main principles that we already saw at the beginning of this video, which is essentially to make sure you're summarizing things into key concepts or key words, and that you're asking yourself questions about the stuff that you have already looked at and try and connect it with other concepts. And then there's one more method that I want to go through. This one is a little bit more advanced, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it because, frankly, you can watch entire videos on this, and there are right ways and wrong ways to do it. But I want to touch on it because it is probably one of the most effective note-taking methods because it does help you draw a lot of those connections, and that is the what we'll call the mind map method of note-taking. So mind mapping is this notion of you essentially take the information in your head and and you put it on paper in the form of a map. When you do this, what you end up with is you will have sort of these maps, which are sort of start from one keyword, and then they will branch out to different concepts. And then your concept might have different branches, which is kind of like, here's a proof of this concept. And then that proof has an example. And then there might be, a second example over here. And then you come back to the concept and maybe there is a counter example, and so on and so forth. And so you end up with this map of information where as you are learning, you're adding different things to the tree in a way where your brain is being forced to see the connections and the relationships between different keywords and different concepts. So it really helps with that very first principle of understanding how you put all of these different things together. The challenge with the mind map, though, is if you are not practiced at doing mind maps, it can be very confusing and it can lead to kind of difficulty in reviewing because you come back and you look at your mind map and you don't really understand what any of these arrows mean. So it's really important that if you're going to use the mind map method of note-taking, that you spend a decent amount of time after you've created your initial mind map to go back through it and to clean it up and reorganize it. Reorganizing the mind map is actually one of the most important parts of mind mapping, and it creates that's where you really get the real value out of it. Now, I do want to put a little bit of a caveat on mind mapping, or a little bit of a warning, if you will. And my warning is mind mapping has become really, really popular in the last few years. And because it's been really popular, there's 1,000,001 softwares out there that allow you to do mind mapping. In my experience, none of them are actually particularly well suited to learning because the process of creating the mind maps is so intensive that you spend more time fiddling with the tool than you do actually taking notes. So if you're going to use mind mapping, my suggestion is do this with plain old pen and paper, or at the very most, use a tablet with pen where you can kind of just freeform what you're thinking, and avoid all of those fancy mind mapping softwares that allow you to create these beautiful trees and that are color coded and so on and so forth. Okay. The other thing I should note when you're mind mapping, there's nothing wrong with, as you're mind mapping, also including little doodles and drawings to kind of engage that part of your brain as well. There's no rule that says you can't. And those softwares that force you to kind of follow very rigid structures will not allow you to do that. That's yet another reason why I think you should avoid those mind mapping tools for learning purposes. And the last thing that I want to talk about, because you can't really talk about note-taking without addressing this question, because it's become a really popular question over the last 10 to 20 years, and that is, when you're taking notes, should you take notes on paper or should you take notes electronically? And the reality is, you will get a lot of different answers depending on who you talk to. There has been research that suggests that taking notes by hand actually improves the ability to recall things later on. But there's also been other research that has suggested that conclusion is a little bit flawed, because it has more to do with how you take the notes versus the technology that you're using to take them. My personal take on this is, I have always taken handwritten notes, even when I was in a school setting and everyone else was using laptops. I'm just more comfortable writing notes by hand. But as you'll notice, I'm also using a tablet to take notes here, and it kind of replicates the feel of taking notes on paper, but with the added benefit of I can get all of this stuff on a single page without needing to kill 100 trees. And it's going to be saved, and I can go back to it later, and I don't need to worry about losing track of individual pieces of paper. At the end of the day, paper versus technology, what it comes down to is which one feels better to you. The one thing you need to keep an eye out is sometimes technology allows you a little bit too much ease. And so because it's sometimes easier to take notes on technology, you can find yourself falling into the trap of taking those transcript style notes and not doing the actual hard work of understanding concepts, linking them together, asking questions about them, and then coming back to that and cleaning it up, because all you've really done is just spent all of your time transcribing things word for word. So if you're the type of person who feels like they have a tendency to go into transcription mode, my suggestion to you would be, take some time to take your notes by hand. And then once you have kind of kicked that habit, then you can reintroduce technology later. And here's a bonus tip for you, and something that is going to be a little bit out of left field, but there's one other way that you could potentially look at taking notes that could be really helpful, and that is to not take notes at all. Yes, that's right. I'm actually suggesting that you not take any notes. The reasoning behind this is because if taking notes verbatim allows your brain to shut down and not really pay attention, flat out saying I'm not going to take any notes forces your brain to try and capture as much information as possible, because you do not have the safety net of writing something down that you know you can refer back to later. And so you have to be that much more focused and that much more on top of your game. Is that a little bit scary? 100% it's a little bit scary, and I don't necessarily suggest this for everyone, but I do think that it is a very realistic way that you can learn a lot more by simply not taking notes at all. And if you're going to do that, then I do suggest that if you are going to try and remember everything, that you do take some time after the meeting, the lecture, whatever it is, to then jot down your notes so that they don't disappear completely. Because remember, putting down those items and writing them by hand, that's all part of the encoding process. But by allowing yourself to just fully pay 100% attention and not have to worry about capturing certain things on paper or on a screen, it really gives you a much greater level of focus. It's something that I've done in the past in courses that I've taken, and it's worked really well for me. Then again, I've also done courses where I didn't take notes and it didn't work out so well. So it might also be a question of the material and how comfortable you are with it. Something to think about, something to keep in mind. There's no one anywhere who said that in order to be successful, you absolutely 100% must take notes. It's just a habit that we've all developed. But question that habit, see what works for you, try things out, make it your own. So now that you figured out how to take awesome notes, what do you do with them? Well, I got a couple of different videos about how to study for exams in university, and another video on how to cram if you didn't really do all that much studying throughout the semester. Take a look at those, and until next time, cheers.